Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event at the Commonwealth Club of California. My name is Dan Pfeiffer. I'm a co-host of Pod Save America, and I was here most recently for my recent book, Battling the Big Lie. I'm pleased to be back here in an actual event with people in person, which is very exciting. And I'm pleased to be joined by my friend Tim Miller, who is a longtime Republican consultant. Former Republican consultant, and author of the new book, Why We Did It, during his time in the Republican Party. Tim worked for many candidates, the RNC. He worked on the famous RNC autopsy, the 2012 election, of which all of whose recommendations were adopted to a T, which we will talk about. He's also served as co-founder and political director of the advocacy group Republican Voters Against Trump, and he is now a writer for The Bulwark. In his new book, Why We Did It, Tim cuts through the past 2 decades of political shifts, compromises, and decisions made by the GOP, and how it set us on a collision course for 2016, Donald Trump, and everything that happened on January 6th. Tim's book is great. It is a funny, raw, accurate diagnosis of politics, the Republican Party, and really more than almost anything I've read over the last few years helps explain how we got to this moment right now from the point of view of someone who was there to see it all in the front row. So please welcome Tim to the Commonwealth Club. Tim, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dan. I like being in your seat better.
Yeah, that's right.
Back next.
Trust me, it's going to be very tough questions. As you interjected to point out, you're a former Republican consultant. You have been about as vocal against your party as any member of the Republican establishment, not named Liz Cheney, has been over the last many years. But before we get to the former part, let's ask, why did you become a Republican in the first place? What led you down that path to career in Republican politics?
Yeah, I was a pretty dorky child. And I was attracted to politics as a young age. Actually, at the very start, my interest in politics began when I had a bet with my grandmother. She thought that George H.W. Bush would beat Bill Clinton. I just sensed that was not going to happen. I don't know why, as a 5th grader. And so we had a $1 bet, which I won. And that kind of got me addicted to politics. And frankly, I think I was attracted, if you look back to 96 and 2000, which are the first campaigns that got me into politics, I was attracted to this notion of the Republican Party as being one of free markets and free people, one that helped get rid of the limits on individuals' ability to achieve success. You know, my father was, sorry for the cliche, an up from his bootstraps kind of guy that gained success, and so that part of it appealed to me. This notion that we were a shining city on a hill. Remember that when Republicans thought we were a shining city on a hill and people might want to come here, and that it would be appealing to be here because of our freedoms and our society was
Reagan
so welcoming.
never mentioned the wall around the hill.
He didn't mention,
Yes.
with moats, with alligators and the moat was around the hill. So that appealed to me. And then, as I get into in the book, I think once I got into politics, it very quickly went from those kind of earnest reasons of being drawn to the Republicans to really enjoying the game and enjoying the sport of it and wanting to win and wanting to beat the other side. And I think that during our era, this was like kind of common. It was more common on my side, I think, than on your side. But this notion that, we liked the West Wing, and for whatever reason, your family was Republican or Democrat. You ended up on a team, and now you're in Washington. And once you're on a team in Washington, it's hard to get off it. You're not going to get hired by the Democrats. I interviewed one guy from the book who is a very high-level Republican now, who said he's never voted for a Republican for president in his life. I was like, that's a pretty odd, little fact about something in politics.
I mean, did he vote for Democrats or did he vote for independents?
In 2008, the Palin freaked him out, and he thought it was cool to vote for the first black president, so he did. And then he sat out 2012, and then Trump came around, and all of a sudden, he's working for a Republican governor at the top levels of the party. He voted for the person he worked for. But I asked him, I said, well, could you have worked for Obama, do you think? And he said, yeah, I kind of barely fell on this one side of the line in 2008 when the stakes just didn't feel as high. And I know that you probably didn't feel that way in 2008, but if you look at McCain and Obama, I think it's easy to understand how people rationalize that, right? Like John McCain was a person of dignity and integrity, served the country. He believed that climate change was a problem and that we should have a cap and trade deal. He wanted to welcome immigrants. He didn't think that we should torture people. The notion that there were these like huge fundamental differences between those two, there were real differences, but you can see how someone kind of wrapped up in the sport of it might decide, okay, like I really like, I'm a person who has a job to do, and I enjoy that job, and that's what I'm going to do first and foremost. And I definitely found myself in that camp.
And you obviously you've been on cable a lot over the last 6 years. You've been part of many political groups attacking Trump. You have been very vocally critical of other members of your party on Twitter. But writing this book is like a different step, right? Like the book the first half of the book is about you and your journey, about how you ended up at this point. It is also, the second half is really about some of the people who you have worked with, had like some were even maybe mentors to you or people you trusted who have gone on to sort of debase themselves in service of Trump and to write about them in these explicit ways, burn some bridges. I mean, maybe they were burned already, but just talk to me a little bit about the process of deciding to write the book and maybe if there's been fallout or blowback from some of the people you have written about.
Well, I felt like there were two elements of the book that kind of represent this first half and second half that also represent my motivations for doing it. One is I felt like there was like a sense of atonement, right? Even though I had fought Trump, as you said, I still kind of felt icky looking back on some of the stuff that I did. And I felt like, when how the publishing business goes, I get a call from an agent and they're like, I want you to write a book that's like the 10 douchiest Trump grifters in America. They're like, we'll sell 1 million copies. Yes. And I was like, that's kind of appealing. But then I thought, oh man, I don't think I can really write that book like in good conscience without kind of reckoning with what my complicity and how I was part of this. And I feel like for readers of good faith, if I'm going to get anyone who is persuadable, maybe some Pod Save America listeners would have liked that book, but like if I'm going to get anybody that's persuadable, I need to take some accountability. So the first half of it was really kind of reflecting on myself. If I'm going to understand how my friends and mentors went along with something that's immoral or unethical or evil, I have to look back at how I did, right? And so I think that was kind of the motivation for the first part. And then the second part was really a curiosity, right? Like rather than write about, the Stephen Millers and the worst of the worst, I wanted to write about people that I felt like there was a little bit of a gray area, like the people who knew better, the people who told me they knew better, because I still didn't, despite having lived all this for 6 years, I still didn't feel like I fully understood why literally all of my friends and colleagues went along with this. I mean, 97.5% of the people that I worked with went along with this. And
in that, when you say went along with it, like that is degrees of people who you write about, like your book, like your friend Caroline Wren, whose name is on the January Stop the Steal permit, to people who work just stayed in the party and work for random members of Congress or in leadership, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that there's different gradations of how they justified it, right? Like somebody like Caroline, obviously, which we can talk about, got basically sucked up into the cult and fully believed all of the MAGA nonsense. Some of my other friends, many of whom are not on the record in the story, but who I wanted to speak to me honestly, decided that they couldn't work for Trump, right? But that wouldn't stop them from working for, random senators, Cory Gardner. You can list all of the different Republican senators who are varying degrees of normal, and I just, they I kind of got it, right? Like at some level, you're like, well, money and they have a job and a career. So at a surface level, I got it. But I felt like I really wanted to dig deeper and understand, maybe there were things that I didn't know about them, right? Maybe, this whole time I thought I was playing this big game and I was kind of this moderate Republican and they were way more conservative than I realized. And I was just kind of filling in the blanks in my head. And one of the things I discovered in those conversations was a lot of them did have a much deeper well of hatred for the left and for Obama in particular. I thought this was an interesting insight, was the people of my friends who went along with Trump to a person, hated Obama much more than the few of us never Trumpers, right? Like the whole time I kind of was like, I disagreed with Obama. I didn't love, Obamacare could have been better. Solyndra wasn't that great, right? But I don't know. Me and you could go to the bar afterwards and have a beer. Like I didn't hate him, right? I would love to go to sit at a basketball game with Obama. The people that I interviewed, what I discovered was this whole kind of kafebe, this fake show of performative fighting that I thought I was doing, for a lot of them, it was more real than I realized.
And why did you think they hated Obama?
Why do you think? Think they hated Obama?
Look, I think there's a broader question about race in this, but I don't want to assign, that is the animating part of a lot of, obviously, how we get to this point, part of how the Republican Party gets here. But I don't want to assume that's the only or primary reason these people who work in politics necessarily feel that way. Yeah, no,
race obviously is a part of it. You hear the things that like maybe don't sound racist on the surface, but it's like, Obama was so condescending.
Yeah.
And it's like, was he? I didn't feel that way. I mean, maybe, I don't know, more condescending than your average politician? Like, I don't think so. So there was, I think, clearly a racial element. With the base, there was clearly a racial, almost an explicit racial element. You look back at the Tea Party movement, right, and this notion that was about government spending, right, is preposterous in retrospect, right? And at the time, though, it kind of seems like, okay, maybe it's about government spending, but it's clear that had Obama's first bill been, whatever, cap and trade, they would have pretended they were mad about that, or abortion, it was this sort of racial and also, cultural, which race is an element of, but also this sort of elite coastal versus real America element. So I think that is part of the reason, for sure. I also, as I get into in the book, is for a lot of these folks, it is unfortunately just this base, annoyance with liberals in their life that gets kind of projected onto everybody, not just Obama, not just black Democrats, but like Elizabeth Warren or any, which could be a little bit of sexism, but even Joe Biden now even gets it. Lindsey Graham famously in Jonathan Martin's book said on January 6th, like, how could people get mad at Joe Biden? Maybe this will be a good moment for the country to come together. It's like, well, they found things to be mad at Joe Biden about. So, I do think that what kept coming up in the Caroline conversation that I got to put on the record, that really kind of stopped
maybe just tell people a little bit who Caroline is. Because it's the framing part of the book, I think.
Yeah, right? Sure. So Caroline Wren is a good friend of mine, and like a really personal friend. You have DC friends. Me and Dan are DC friends.
Yes.
We've never had dinner together, but Caroline is like a personal friend.
Yes.
That we would talk about, our life, adoption, or relationship troubles. And, she was a very moderate Republican, worked with me on John Huntsman's campaign, worked for a lot of rhinos. I tell books in the story about how she, on her own, flies to Germany to, bring gifts to refugees. This is a person that is not a hateful person in their heart, at least to my experience. And she gets sucked up into Trump world. It's kind of by accident. She's the finance director for the RNC convention. You don't think Trump's going to win. Trump wins the convention, and then all of a sudden you get in this bunker mode. She becomes very defensive of him and of his people, and then you start to enjoy the access and kind of the star power of it. All of a sudden you're hanging out with the family, you're backstage, you're on Trump Force One. This all makes me sick, but I can understand how somebody might get sucked up in this. And and eventually she just kind of gets caught up in the accoutrement of being around a president, being on the inside circle, and she ends up, as you said, on January 6th, having her name on the permit for the mall because she was doing advance or whatever, setting up the chairs for the VIPs. And so we went and had drinks in Santa Monica for 6 or 7 hours. And I was like, I need to understand this. How did we go so far apart? I thought we were the same. We were both moderate Republicans. How can you be fully Trump cult and me be never Trumper? And, there are a lot of revelations in that conversation, because we had so many tequilas. But the one thing that...
I was hungover just reading that shit.
Yeah, again, another round. But the one thing that really stuck out to me that just kind of stopped me short is, we kept going back and forth on all the various issues and why are you mad at this and what do you think about this and that. And finally I get to, I just don't get it. Is there something about him you really, really like, or is all of it just you've come to hate all of the people that hate Trump? And she thinks about it for a second. and then says, I really think it's the latter. She's like, I'm just so sick of these liberals and their Priuses with their coexist stickers, drinking their coffee culottes and telling me and wagging their finger at me and making me drink out of my paper straw. I'm like, I hate paper straws too, but what does that have to do with Donald Trump? Like nothing. And so, I think that was the most stark example of a conversation that I had 20 of when writing this book. Every normal Republican that I talked to, the conversation would go and go, and eventually you get to a point where they'd start, you get under a layer, and they'd have this grievance, and sometimes it'd be about their kids' school and the DEI packets, and sometimes it'd be about the media's being mean to them, and sometimes it'd be that their friend won't talk to them anymore because they say they're a racist because they work for Donald Trump, and whatever it is, like these various grievances and hatreds of the left ended up kind of allowing them to rationalize what they did.
And to try to unpack that a second, is that because they think he will fight harder against these forces, or is a more effective fighter, or he's tougher than the other Republicans, or he just can be sort of their asshole id in public?
Yeah. Well, for some, it's asshole id. Rich Lowry said this, and I was the head of the New York National Review, which is supposed to be like the erudite, journal of conservative thought.
It's now it's Polysyllabic Federalist.
Yeah, exactly. He wrote an article like 2 weeks before the election this year. It's like, Donald Trump is a middle finger to all the people that you hate in America. And I was just like, really? This is why you're voting for Donald Trump? And it just seems so childish. Yeah. And he's supposed to be like the editor of the thought of the William F. Buckley, the inheritor of conservative thought. But so they're just varying copycats of that. And so for some people, Dan, I think it was like Caroline, it just tickled something inside them. This like emotion of they are mad at the left or the changes in the country. I think for people out in America, for some of them, it's like they're mad about the changing racial dynamics, and like when they watch their movies, the white people aren't the heroes anymore. Like things that are as simple as that. And then for a lot of my friends that I focused on in the book, I really think for them it was more of a rationalization. Like the one guy that I remember that stands out to me, he says to me something like, I hate him, and there's not much I like about him, but the way I'm treated, it's a white guy, obviously, the way I'm treated by woke culture, it just has left me no option but to really grab onto the one or two things I really agree with him on and focus on that while I continue along my job.
They made me do it strategy.
Yeah, they made me do it strategy. And I was just like, that is like, I can't believe you had just admitted that to me on the telephone. And I know we're off the record, but I'm going to know who you are. But I think, but the point, I think the interesting thing is that in that culture, which I'm like not in anymore, which is why that was the most surprising thing to me in doing these interviews. I just think that that's kind of conversation, right? Like at the bar, around the other Republican political types, like, who know better, who know about Donald Trump's, how dangerous he is. Like that's how they make themselves feel better.
In your political journey, right? Working for McCain, working for Huntsman, trying to help Romney beat Obama, Jeb Bush.
Jeb Bush was down.
Yes. Let's go before Jeb Bush. That's when you're dealing with Trump. But were there some moments on that journey where you saw the party turning in ways that were alarming, that, whether it's stuff in the Tea Party or elsewhere, there were sort of warning signs to you, at least of a date, even if it didn't mean that Donald Trump would be president one day, but like a dangerous undercurrent within the party that made you uncomfortable?
Yeah. I mean, this book starts in Iowa with Sarah Palin in 2008 with McCain. And I'm sure this stuff goes back further than that. If this only you want to write a history book, you can go back to Goldwater or whatever. But I was there. So I was in Iowa in 2007, I guess, in this primary. And McCain at that time is working with Ted Kennedy on an immigration reform bill, which shows that, as bad as the party has always been, there was some good stuff happening back then. There has been some change. So he's doing that. And every question at the town hall we're getting is about immigration, amnesty, and this weird conspiracy theory about the NAFTA superhighway. And they're all mad at him. They all hate him. And McCain's poll numbers tank. And I'm off the campaign after that because he has to fire everybody. He can't afford staff. And then he has this rebound mostly because none of the other candidates are very good. Yeah. And during his rebound, he shifts his immigration rhetoric a little bit. And McCain-Kennedy dies. He doesn't become Donald Trump, but he starts to sort of do the thing, which is like, well, we can't do any immigration reform until we have a wall. He does later he goes on to do the build the dang fence out. And then the General Palin happens, and the crowds at the Palin event were like that McCain caucus crowd, but like on steroids, right? It's all the deplorables, 10 years later, right? There's McCain rallies, they're feral. The McCain rallies are like very staid, and the Palin rallies are like people shouting about how Obama's a Muslim. So it's obviously was in 2008, it was all there, which is like why I felt like I had to do the mea culpa part, because I saw it, I knew it. And, I slowly get sucked back in because John Huntsman's a moderate, and then, you're on the career ladder. So I think it was super clear in 2008, and I think that, frankly, Trump, probably could have won the 2012 primary.
Yeah, I think he
almost certainly would have won the 2012 primary, and probably frankly could have won the 2008 primary, or Palin could have won the 2012 primary. And it was delayed. The inevitable takeover of the populist wing of the party, the crazy wing, was only delayed 4 years because there were no good vessels for it. Romney's opponents were like Rick Santorum
and Newt Gingrich, who almost beat him, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, who still almost beat him despite the fact they were horrible candidates and has-beens, and were really bad at channeling the sort of populist rage that Palin and Trump were so good at channeling. So I think it was super clear from 2008.
Do you think there were things Republican Party leaders could have done, like you write in the book about how they just begin this dance, particularly after the sort of you go that I don't know how to give a little history here. Bush wins in 2004.
Yep.
Everyone thinks two well-known political reporters wrote a book called The Emerging Republican Majority.
Yep.
The view is Democrats would never gain power again. Republicans were making gains with Latino voters, and black voters were moving to their camp, and Democrats were screwed. And then all of a sudden, George Bush, between Iraq, Katrina, George Bush goes in the toilet. Democrats win the House and Senate. Obama wins by a margin no one ever possibly thought expected, and no one thought someone who looked or was named Barack Hussein Obama could get elected. And then the party is trying to scratch its way back to relevance.
Right.
And as you write in the book, they get in bed with the Tea Party far right elements.
Yeah.
Was there a point, do you think, where someone in the party could have said, like McCain did in his rally, famously in 2008 to the woman who called Obama Muslim, could have said no and could have maybe put a stop to this, or were we inevitably on this path?
I think we're inevitably on this path, but it could have been healthier. So there was the Tim Miller autopsy, compassionate conservatism, climate change, gay marriage, let's be nice to immigrants party was never happening. Okay, that was never going to happen. And that was just wish casting by us in 2012, which I spent a lot of time talking about. I'm interested, and if you look at, we're also myopic in America, but if you look globally, every conservative party in the world right now in first world countries is a nationalist, populist, conservative party. Yeah. So, these trends, are not unique to us. So I'm interested in the counterfactual. This is the, real Marxism has never been tried. Yeah. Real, good faith conservative populism has never been tried. I'm intrigued by okay, let's say instead of trying to force feed the base, we'll be nicer to immigrants, and gays, we would have said, Bush screwed up with Iraq. We're going to stop with the globalism and stop with the adventurous wars, and we're going to stop with the trade that's sending your jobs to China or whatever, and we're going to do more of a kind of protectionist, nationalist, genuine, policy shift in the party. That tries to meet some of these voters' grievances, the legitimate grievances. Some of their grievances, as we've talked about, are based on race and bigotry. Some of them are legitimate, their communities have been hollowed out. It was the people that got sent to the war were not people from my neighborhood. And so they have reason to be upset. So could that have happened, right? Could there have been a Republican pivot more to a responsible it wouldn't have appealed to Tim Miller like that party, but could that party? Yeah, I don't know. There's no responsible populist in the GOP right now. But
if there's anyone in that.
Yeah, if you look, I guess let's say that hypothetically, had the J.D. Vance before he turned into a conspiracy theorist freak, right?
Yeah.
Like had the J.D. Vance that wrote the book, and then said, okay, I'm gonna just offer these more protectionist, nationalist policy agenda items. Could that person have, offered a lead, a Republican Party that looks more like, this is a bad analogy this week, but like Boris Johnsonism, right? Like maybe, I don't know. That would have been better than what we have. We're like our democracy is in threat right now. I still would have left the party probably over that, but I think that's an interesting counterfactual.
It's interesting to think about that because probably the reason that did not happen is not just like the magic of Donald Trump. It's also that it's the incredible and probably irreconcilable tension between even to this day, the sort of Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan economic agenda and the economic beliefs of the base, right? You have this working class base and that, generally, even though as long as they don't know us from Barack Obama, they want government health care, they want Social Security, they want Medicare. They don't think it's great that Amazon is paying $0 in taxes. But so, that sort of like was there's Steve Bannon, this is like one of Steve Bannon's sort of ideas after 2012 was we can't talk about that stuff, so we got to go tickle the culture war sides of their brain. So it's like, you have to sort of reshape the GOP electorate to get there, I think.
You just had to dump the Ryan agenda, which I guess is, again, like someone could have, instead of Donald Trump, could have come into the 2016 primary and said, I'm going to try to run a quixotic campaign where we dump the Paul Ryan trickle-down agenda, and that person might have won. I don't know. The real problem, in my opinion,
which Trump did sort of do.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. But he also added all the the cruelty and the bigotry and the freak show and all the conspiracy. So, okay, so can you decouple those two things is the question. And I kind of think no, right? Yeah. Because in my original joke about Marxism, like the reason why conservative populism, like in genuine policy terms, can't really work is because you're always going to get, beaten by somebody, that can go into Fox and go into cable and offer something that's more red meat, right? That tickles people's grievances at a deeper level. And I just, there's no infrastructure for this kind of thing, right? Like, the Fox suits are not interested in a genuine populist, like anti Wall Street party, right? Like that's not what they're interested in. They're happy with the tax cut agenda and like throwing some red meat about the Ground Zero Mosque or the caravan or whatever to people. And so I think the conservative media complex probably makes it impossible.
I mean, one thing you and I certainly had in common was we thought there was very little chance Donald Trump would win
the election. That one. That was a miss.
Yeah, we were wrong about that. But not to do hypotheticals, but I have always sort of, I was wrong about who was going to win the presidency, but I was sure Donald Trump was going to win the primary.
Yeah.
I was positive of that because, and that's one of the things when you're working for Obama, is I got to see how these people reacted to Obama. Like I got to sit in a room where a Republican congressman called him boy. Like you sort of know what what is happening there, and it's you're very.
Is that congressman in leadership now?
That congressman is not in Congress right now. Because he got beat by someone more conservative, more racist than someone who would say that in public. Yes, yeah. His problem is he kept his racism in the privacy of a conference room. But I've been operating under the theory that the Republican Party was going to burn itself out and that would theoretically reform or change or something would happen after losing 08, 12, and 16. What did you think would happen if Trump, as you and I had both thought, had lost in 16? How would your party have reacted, your former party?
Yeah, I don't think it would have changed much, to be honest, because this was a bottom-up thing. I just thought Trump was too boobish to win the primary in 2016, so I was wrong about that. But I did think a crazy person. Like I was like, if it isn't going to be Jeb, it's going to be he's going to be a crazy person. I thought it was probably more likely to Cruz than Trump, but I thought that it was to be one of those two. And I write in the book, like the story about Reince, the night I realized it was going to be Trump was like after one of the debates, and I met Reince Priebus, who was the RNC chair, my former boss, in a bar after the debate, and I was like, you need to quit your job, Trump's about to win, and like you should just get out before it gets crazy for you. And he promised me that he said, don't worry, we need to have a good person in the room, and if things get out of hand, then I'll quit. I promise you. I was like, he ended up getting fired by tweet. Yeah. So he did not live up to that promise. So I saw that the demand bottom up was eventually going to push to the direction of a more populist route. So look, I think that Trump did loses the popular vote, right? So had Michigan and a few of those states fallen the other way. I just don't. There's no evidence to me that the party pushes back to Marco, right? Because the only groups that wanted that already tried to stop Trump, right? Like I was part of that when I read about this. I was in our principals pack, and it was all the big donors were funding us, and all of the mainstream politicians were pushing it. And we tried to stop Trump in the primary in 2016, and voters didn't want it. So I think probably the question is who then is smart enough in 2020 to like learn from Trump and be one tick more and do what Ron DeSantis is doing right now, right? Be like one tick more normal, one tick more acceptable to elite types, but still kind of feeding the populace, the buddy fights, the owning the libsism, like the owning the libs kind of populist style was going to win a primary no matter what in 2020.
And so, well, I'll come back to this at the end, but let's talk a little about the autopsy for a second for people who may not be familiar with internal party committee workings of a decade ago.
It was a pretty important document.
Yes. But I mean, it is a pretty, it's a very significant point in history, like in political history about the party. And so talk a little bit about what that work was, what you guys found, and sort of your reaction to having that treated as it was.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, we grabbed like about 10 of the smartest people in Republican politics. Some of them you might have heard of, Elise Stefanik and Sean Spicer and me, some others. We just looked at the Romney loss and said, like, what does the party need to do to not have this happen next time, right? And put out a document full of recommendations. The long and short of it was some of it was just blocking and tackling stuff. Like the Obama people are way better at digital, and we should be better at that. And like we should have more offices and more city. There's some of it was just boring political tactics. On the messaging side of things, this part of the document was headed up by Ari Fleischer, who is now a Fox News television celebrity who's like Donald Trump Jr.'s best friend. So
and like PR man for hire by despots around the world.
Yeah. Saudi Arabia's man in New York. Yes. So he didn't heed his own advice, but he led this up, and it was basically, we need to soften language around abortion in particular, in order to appeal more to suburban women. We need to soften language and maybe change our policy on immigration to attract Latinos. We need to push criminal justice reform, which some Republicans at the time were already actually doing. There's kind of this Rand Paul push for that in order to attract more black voters. And kind of through these, and he even suggested that we change policies on gay marriage and abortion privately that both got rejected, didn't make the final document, which I put some of those emails in the book. Sorry, Ari. The short of it that came out was that that's how we kind of will broaden the coalition in the hopes that the Republicans can the next time win, more of these purple states that Romney had lost. Obviously, Trump went absolutely the opposite of that direction, right? And in some ways, which we just talked about, I think one of our failings was that there was another path, right, through working class white communities, right, that maybe didn't necessarily need to do the bigotry of Trumpism, but that would have required changing, to your point, the Paul Ryanism of the economics, which nobody in this room wanted to do. And so essentially Trump, uses our recommendations like toilet paper, wins the nomination. And the interesting thing for me that I tried to focus on in the book is there were 9 of us, and so me and Sally Bradshaw totally quit the party over this. We're like, okay.
And she was
Jeb Bush's top Karl Rove. She's Jeb's Karl Rove. And so she just quit politics, opened a bookstore in Tallahassee, and got a tattoo that says "Speak Truth." So Sally's the hero of the book. She's just like, screw this. Okay, I gave you the document about how the party can win and be nice to minorities and women. And you didn't take it, so I'm out. And then another portion of people who I talk about kind of just end up being strategists who work on the outside of politics. They still are like, the Trump thing's a little icky. Henry Barber is one of the characters. He's Haley Barber's, you might have heard of, son. And then there's another group that says, screw this, I'm going whole hog with Trump. And I don't care about all this. And that's Sean Spicer, Reince Priebus, Elise Stefanik, Ari. And some of these people interviewed with me. Some of them refused to. Elise sent me a note that said she reads my Twitter feed, so she will not be participating in the book, despite the fact that we used to work together. But so I interviewed all the ones who wouldn't interview with me. I interviewed all Elise's friends. I looked at Politico Playbook was finally useful for something. I saw who went to her wedding, and so I called all the people that were at her wedding that was in Playbook to figure out, to interview them. Be like, what the fuck happened to Elise? Sorry, excuse me. And so that is kind of how the formation of the second half of the book is trying to figure out how can 9 people who all saw that the party should get more compassionate and open and less bigoted go such different directions.
And that document just there was a moment where people believed in elements of it, right? There was real moment,
even Sean Hannity came out
Yes.
for immigration reform
Yes.
the week after we put out the document.
Yes.
He was a good party man. He's
Yes.
like, all right, that's what we got to do. We're for immigration reform.
Yeah, that's exactly Murdoch came out for it and was advocating for it. There was, the gang of 8, Marco Rubio included, were in the House. They were for it. And then, obviously this was rejected by the base, but sort of in the view of people who were working in the White House at the time, trying to see if we could take advantage of this moment to get immigration reform done. A key moment was when Eric Cantor, who was the House whip, lost his primary. I guess he was the House leader, the number 2 in leadership, Boehner's deputy, which is not something you probably want in your Wikipedia page, but lost his primary by a lot. Yeah. Do you think it's just that document was never had a path? Because there is a history here too, which is after Bush won in 2004, Ken Mehlman, Bush's campaign manager, goes to the RNC, declares that we are going to build this multicultural, diverse electorate, hired people to try to focus on Latino voters and black voters. You mentioned the McCain-Kennedy bill. My experience with that bill was I was working in the Senate at the time, and constituent mail came to a halt because conservative voters were mailing bricks to the Senate with a note attached that said, build the wall, which should have been a real sign of what was going to happen. And that was in 2006. Was there ever a path for this, or this is where we were ended up?
I don't think there was ever a path for it. Again, I'm not a person of inevitability of history. I do think history is contingent and leadership matters. And some, had Marco been a little better, right? Could Marco have figured out? No,
he could not have been better.
Could somebody like that, right, have jammed through an immigration reform and then thrown the base some red meat on something else, right? That's how you would have had to have done it. No, like I said, the base was not up for this from the start, and so eventually there was going to be a revolt, and the distance between what Republicans elites wanted and what the base wanted was untenable. I don't think that it meant that Donald Trump was inevitable. I don't think that doesn't mean that had a few more Republicans showed a little more cojones, we couldn't have snuck through 60 votes. And it did come close. I mean, right? Even John McCain, who's one of the heroes of this book, voted against the DREAM Act in 2008, which was sick, because he was worried about his J.D. Hayworth talk radio primary. It's just do you really want to be a senator that bad? And then he saves Obamacare in the end. So 50-50. I don't know. I like the DREAM Act better than Obamacare on balance. I kind of wish you would have done the thumbs down on the first one. But so no, there could have been some examples of people taking one from the team, like Liz Cheney is right now, but eventually that tension was going to have to be resolved.
So where does it end, right? We have a 2-party system it's basically locked in how the Electoral College has decided. The Republican Party is on a path, is getting worse since Trump, in my view,
for sure,
and and much more dangerous in my view.
For sure.
And so, the idea, if they lose to Biden again, is there any point, is there anything that you think could change the trajectory of the party, force a reckoning? Because Democrats, not in a dangerous direction, but after we lost in 88, the party, all of the various groups within the party, we've now lost in 80, 84, and 88, all the various groups in the party got together, they adopted, so they sort of, everyone came on board and were willing to make some tough changes, many of which I don't ideologically agree with, but were probably necessary to win in 1992. Like, nothing focuses the mind like losing several elections in a row.
Yeah.
Although Republicans haven't won the popular vote, they've won the popular vote once since 1988.
One
But is there anything that you can see that would, or do we just have to wait for this generation to retire?
No, I mean, hopefully we make it that long.
Yeah.
Well, Trump could die.
Yeah. But I feel like Trump's not really the problem.
That's the best thing that could happen. No, well, he is the problem because here's the problem. Here's why he's the problem is that like well, I'll back into the Trump death thing.
Yeah. But don't miss it because I think people here might want to hear it. So
I'll get back. We'll get back to the Trump death thing.
Yes.
The best possible scenario is that the party is, again, I go back to Boris Johnsonism, that like the party says, okay, Trump is just so unviable electorally that that we are going to, move on to somebody like Ron DeSantis or whatever, who is not great, okay, to say the least, but does not share Trump's psychopathy. Right? Like the unique dangers that we have ahead of us are related to Trump's psychopathy. Because as bad as Ron DeSantis is, like you have to be a uniquely deranged person to be able to continue to keep up a lie for 3 years. To tell people that you think that Hugo Chavez, who's dead, like broke into our voting machines and changed the numbers just to hurt you, not to hurt any other Republicans. And then keep telling people that for years on end, where 50, 60 million people believe it. Like,
yeah, but every member of the Republican Party says that now.
Yeah, but they have to go along with him, right? Yeah. To be the person who's like, I am sticking with this crazy freaking lie. Like, you have to be completely psychotic, And Ron DeSantis, for all of his problems, which there are many, which we can talk about, like, I just don't think that he's a complete psychopath, right? Like, eventually you become weak. A human wants to connect what they actually believe in their brain with what comes out of their mouth. Like, you can convince yourself of a lie over time, but it's very hard to convince yourself of this level of a lie. So I think that Donald Trump dying would really help as far as the democracy surviving. I don't think that he's going to, though. So that takes us to, I think, the other really bad outcome, which is, we come up to 2024 and he is running, and it's, I think, very hard to imagine how people, no matter what the result is, people accept the result of the election. And I don't want to, say that it make any equivalency or say the left is like the people that stormed the Capitol, but just because of the way Donald Trump has behaved, for good reason, I do not think that people on the left will accept him as a legitimate president again. I think that would be a very dangerous situation. Obviously, if he loses, I think we got very lucky. This is like macabre, but the January 5th blood toll wasn't higher, right? And I think that if he loses again, it would be even more dangerous. So I think that worry to run 2024 is really ugly, and I think that's why him leaving the stage is better. The party itself, is going to range from the best case scenario is somebody like Boris Johnson, who's like a pretty normal conservative who kind of pretends, to plays for the rubes for TV from time to time when he has to, like Ron DeSantis, who is actually, kind of quasi-authoritarian, but wouldn't actually challenge an election.
You don't think? You want to take a bet on that?
I don't. Yeah, let's take a bet on that.
Okay.
What do you want to bet? Tickets to the Warriors game or something?
Yeah, tickets to the Warriors game. I mean, I hope we never have to cover
Will the society still be alive?
Yeah.
Will the Warriors still be playing at that point? If Ron DeSantis starts in a totalitarian state, a Trump or Tucker, right? This is the worst case. Yeah. So I that is Liz Cheney, God love her, is not walking through the door. Even a Glenn Young, you know what I mean? Even those people aren't going to win a Republican primary. So that's the range of options.
Yeah, Ron DeSantis seems to me like Trump on Adderall, just as dangerous but more focused. I agree, he's probably unlikely. That's what worries a lot of progressives is Trump, because he is such an idiot, left so much meat on the bone in terms of what he could have done with that office to damage the things we care about, to put himself in power. He just was too like Ron DeSantis probably isn't hiring Rudy Giuliani as his attorney to try to prosecute these cases, right?
So this is what I think, like Ron DeSantis is probably more normal dangerous as far as like dismantling the administrative state,
Yeah.
right? Like Trump was completely incompetent at being able to do that, right? You know, like old school extremist Republican stuff, like we'll shut down the EPA or, you know, the right, like that kind of stuff. Like I think that Ron DeSantis super, normal dangerous because he'll be more effective at that. Like the existential threat, like we are going to storm the Capitol, end the democracy, get Secretary of States, we're going to install Rube, Secretary of States, to like say that they're not going to count the votes the right way. I think that's it's not uniquely Trump because now he's like recruited a lot of, like Mastriano in Pennsylvania and all these, but most of these guys are so weird that like their best, case for them is like it's like a Secretary of State.
Yes.
But we can have a lot of little local skirmishes, right? Like I think that's going to happen. And this is all stuff this is why I say Trump is so unique. Like this never would have happened if it like wasn't for Trump, right? It's been somebody else that had lost. Like the notion that now there's going to be this cult of people propping up in Secretary of State's offices and governor's offices in all these states who like no longer think that elections are valid and that votes should be counted fairly. I mean, that's really scary, and that is, happening across the board right now. And I'm worried, particularly if like the economy doesn't change between now and November, that even the freaks are going to get sort of washed in a wave, and we get into a situation in 2024 where there are a lot fewer of the Brad Raffensperger types, and a lot more like Christian nationalists, like people who are happy to overturn an election. So there's some uplifting commentary.
Let's take a couple audience questions here real fast. I can't wait to hear the answer to this. What chance do you think Liz Cheney has in the Republican
0%.
primary? 0%. Yeah. What about
look, Liz Cheney, I hate it. Okay, like back in the normal times, like I was a moderate Republican. Liz Cheney was like as far right as imaginable within the caucus. Okay, like she rejected her own sister for like being a lesbian and like opposed gay marriage. I donated to Mike Enzi, who I do not like, in his primary against Liz Cheney just because I was so pissed at Liz Cheney, right? And so like for Liz Cheney now to have this moment, I think it's great that she's doing it, but I think that this just shows that this has nothing to do with policy. Like this is all about grievance and anger and conspiracy, like that Liz Cheney would get overthrown in favor of Elise Stefanik, who was a Tim Miller moderate rhino squish, like that was her. But now, because she's willing to go along with the Trump cult, she gets to replace Liz Cheney. So that's insight about where the party is. But no, once you've crossed Trump, she's got 0% chance.
And so would you say that probably the only Republican who has crossed Trump who has a chance of surviving just over the next medium term years is Mitt Romney?
Surviving what? Like
Just
in the Senate?
In the party. Just remaining.
Yeah.
Everyone else is retired or lost.
Yeah. Mitt Romney will survive. Utah is unique for various ways. We don't need to get into that. But I look at state offices, Georgia, right? And Raffensperger did survive, which is great. And there are a few green shoots. I think the governors, it's a little bit of a different thing. Voters, kind of want their governor to like be competent in most cases, right? Because they have a real job to do, and they sort of see senators as like, you don't have a real job. Like, all I want you to do is shit post
That's a fact.
on Twitter.
Yes.
And so, I think that there might be some examples of some that survive, but in national office or the notion that someone could run for president, no. And poor Liz Cheney's like going to get crushed by these freaks in the House primary that she's in.
What is interesting, I think, when you look at those primaries, which is why I think Mitt Romney is unique in this, which is Trump can be anti-you and you can win, but you can't be anti-Trump, right? Exactly. That's how like Nancy Mace survived. Yeah. That's how Kemp was a Trump Republican through and through. He just decided to do math for one day in his life, and he had to.
The voters, right? This is how I break down the Republican primary. Most of them, it's about half of the primary are just good, solid Republicans. They like Trump, but they're not in a cult, but they like him fine. And but if he endorses somebody else, they might not care. 40% are Trump cult, right? So if you get Trump endorsement, you have a pretty good chance. And then like 5% are, varying degrees of ready to move on from Trump. And so, if you can put together the 50 and the 5, you can win a primary, right?
Yeah.
Like Trump can, if Trump endorses somebody else, you can still win. But if you're anti-Trump, then you go down to the 5%.
Yeah.
Right. And because those are the only people. And Liz might get a little bit better because some Democrats will go over in Wyoming and, some Cheney loyalists. But, it's like a 20% thing. It's sad. I mean, it shows how much courage she's had, though. So, she's really blown up her career over this. So thank God for her and Kinzinger. But it's kind of crazy. It's just the two of them.
And do you think Trump's going to run in 24?
So I can't get inside his brain.
That would be a hell of a book.
Yeah, exactly. Here's what I think. It's really hard for me to imagine Donald Trump being the opening act for Ron DeSantis, and like sitting down in Mar-a-Lago and let everybody talk about how great Ron DeSantis is. That seems to go against everything in his psychology that I have observed as a Trump watcher for the past however too many years. So, he's not going to go down and just become a painter like George W. Bush and turn off the Twitter machine.
Yes.
That's just not him. So I think that he's going to run because of that, just like jealousy, like the black hole in his heart, like will not let Ron DeSantis take over.
And do you think if Trump runs, he'll face a real primary? And I don't count like a Larry Hogan moderate suicide mission, but like,
I tried so hard to get Larry Hogan to run a suicide mission last time. I was sending people to Annapolis to recruit him.
But do you think like a DeSantis or a Tom Cotton or a Josh Hawley would run against him?
I mean, they would have a lot of money, right? Because all these donors that funded the stuff that I was doing back in 2016 and then completely switched teams as soon as they wanted access in the general election once Trump won, all those guys will give money to somebody else again. They would, if they could just snap their fingers and make them disappear, they would. So I think it'll be tempting for somebody to challenge him.
And if whoever that were to be, what advice would you give them? And I'm not suggesting how you, I'm not saying this is like a John Huntsman Redux or a Tim Miller Republican Squish or whatever you want to share, but like if you were just like my goal, I'm gonna sell my soul. Because we have to beat Trump. Like if Ron DeSantis or someone was running, like what message would you give them to beat Trump?
It's really dark, but like out Trump him, right? Say, I'm sorry. Like I thought that your message was great. And that I totally agree with you that the left is ruining the country. And, what we really need is somebody that is actually able to build the wall and somebody that did not work with Bill Gates on the fake vaccines. Honestly, I like that. I mean, somebody that could actually beat Joe Biden.
Yeah, that to me is the one.
I would not take that job, by the way. I just wrote I just wrote a book. I just wrote a book to clean my conscience. But if someone is out there with no conscience that's watching, that would be my advice to them for how to beat Donald Trump.
That's what I've always thought is the best message against Trump from another Republican is that Trump's a loser. Because there is this real tension between Trump, his Twitter feed, RIP, I guess his truths on Truth Social, Fox News, that Joe Biden is basically Weekend at Bernie's president, and he was able to mastermind a criminal conspiracy to steal the election from Donald Trump. And it's just sort of like you can't beat, if I was a Republican, I'd be like, you couldn't beat, you did great things.
Yeah.
You
couldn't beat Sleepy Joe.
You put all these people on the judge, but you couldn't beat Sleepy Joe. We need somebody who can beat Sleepy Joe would be the way I would do it if I was Ron DeSantis.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think that's possible. I think it's a really outside chance. The problem is it's really hard to execute.
Yeah.
Right. And once you enter a primary against Trump, you become anti-Trump by definition. Right. And so, to run a whole campaign under the hot bright lights, as and being like, I like Mr. Trump. He's pretty great and I greatly admire him. But, he should have built the wall a little better. And he didn't run a very good campaign against Sleepy Joe. But I voted for him. And that gets hard to do that sort of two-step. And so I think it would be a very outside chance. I don't think a 0% chance that could work.
You talk about how these Republicans you talk to, one of the reasons that they worked for Trump or they've justified it is that they find Democrats and liberals annoying. This is the Prius coffee colada thing, which is, I think as you point out in your book, a Dunkin' Donuts creation.
Like a $3.99 Dunkin' Donuts coffee is what's bothering her? I don't know. Whatever, man. You got to be mad about something.
Yeah. But there is some sense, at least, among some political commentators. This shows up in focus groups. It was in a DCCC presentation to the caucus a few months ago that one of the problems that Democrats may be facing in this election is that voters find us annoying.
Yeah.
Do you like?
I do think this is a problem.
Yeah. And what do you like? What do you think drives that? How much of that is real? How much of that is us losing the messaging war to Fox, et cetera? Like, would you have any advice for us on how to be less annoying?
Be less annoying.
Or convince people we're less annoying?
No. Yeah. Look, I think that some of this is obviously media driven, right? And so you have this like huge right-wing media ecosystem from TikTok all the way up through Fox, right? That's just like liberals are annoying, liberals are crazy, right? That's in front of people's face. And so I think that media part, this is your book, so I should have asked you about that question, how to break through that. I think that's one element of it. But I do also think, just from like a messaging standpoint, if you look at, we're going to get really nerdy for 1 second. We can do a book stuff after. But if you look at Democrats' ads, like, they're really good, okay? Democrats' ads are very focused on kitchen table issues and how the Republicans are extreme and they don't care about you. And we're going to actually have results. All they want to talk about is, the 2020 election or abortion stuff. And I care about your life and your family. Okay, but then Democratic candidates' Twitter feeds are very much kind of wrapped up in the social issues of the day and these little fights when they start talking. Like, I met with a Senate candidate the other day who was just asking me for my advice, Democratic Senate candidate, and I said to him, so I went through your feed, and it's like, the other day you were talking about how all of our wealth is stolen from native lands, and I was like, that might be true. Okay, that might be true, but we're not at a Berkeley conference here. You're running for Senate in a swing state, right? So you got to think about what the median voter wants, and this person's TV ads are talking about what the median person's want, right? So I think that there's a little bit of this sort of disconnect. So that's my one piece of advice, and I do think that the COVID stuff, for a while worked for Democrats' favor because Trump was so incompetent.
Trump was COVID. Spreading it to people.
Yeah, yes. Trump literally tried to kill Chris Christie, which is my favorite scene in the book. Chris Christie waddles back to him after Trump literally nearly killed him, and then called him in the hospital and was like, "You're not going to blame this on me." That's a real story.
Yes.
He didn't send him flowers or soup or M&Ms or whatever Chris Christie would want. So I think that this worked in Democrats' favor. But man, after the vaccines came out, don't throw fruit at me, but people are sick of it. People are sick of it. And so having to be reminded about COVID all the time, I do think, is rubs people the wrong way. And there are certain types of voters that have been turned off for that. And that kind of piles on all this media environment stuff that we're talking about. So the real legitimate annoyances get exacerbated by these fake annoyances that get brought up in the media.
In the book, you write, in sort of talking about sort of where you feel that you were culpable as part of being part of this political culture in Washington that was very focused on the game, right? People call it the game. I'm back in the game. Yeah. It's about winning and losing, sort of that maybe the stakes, the people who at least play the game are least affected by what actually happens. Everyone's going to be fine. Washington's a boom town and good times are bad. Losing consultants get hired to work on races all the time. And it was
saw a little fact today that my old boss on the Romney campaign got hired to help Herschel Walker. So, life, boom times.
Who was that?
Great.
Who was that?
Gail Gitcho. She was your counterpart.
That's right.
Your counterpart. You've got a great, successful podcast. She's helping Herschel Walker now.
That's
so,
right.
The money keeps rolling in.
I totally forgot that person existed. Wow.
Hi, Gail.
I was wondering if we would get the 7 big people who worked on the McCain-Away campaign and then came out to Silicon Valley right afterwards. I'm very grateful they did to be in the audience today. So, but speaking of that political culture, I'm one of the things that in 2016 that I talked a lot about with sort of my Obama colleagues, we talked about it on the precursor to podcast to Pod Save America, was could something like this happen to Democrats, right? So first, do you think is there a world in which it's going to be it's obviously not the same. It's not obviously going to be sort of our coalition is different, but could Democrats find themselves working for could we have a candidate who we thought was dangerous that we all worked for anyway.
Yeah, well, I think that some of my, I don't think so. But
And why is that?
Yeah, because I think the voter coalitions are different.
Yeah.
Basically, I like the Republican voters just had no antibodies to crazy because most of them wanted crazy. There are some Democratic voters that want crazy, but the Democratic coalition is much more diverse, right? Literally and racially diverse, but also education level, financial level. And my favorite tweet maybe for 2020 was like, the Joe Biden coalition stretches from Angela Davis to Bill Kristol. It's just like, so because of that, because it's a lot of college educated suburban types, older black voters in particular, are much more resistant to a lot of like the crazy stuff. Could that change eventually, 30 years from now? Sure. But like right now, I think that the Democratic coalition is pretty resistant to somebody like a liberal Trump would be, which is probably like Trump actually. Trump could have just been a Democrat. In the 80s, he was a Democrat, right? Anyway.
In our podcast days, our version of Trump, the person we picked to be like who would be the hypothetical Democratic Trump, which this did not age well at all, but was Kanye West.
Kanye.
What if Kanye had become
right? Yeah. So the thing that I do think is similar that like worries me that I would just as I look at it from the outside and kind of look at it back in the game element of it is the media part of it, right? Like, and I feel like complicity with. And again, like it's not a parallel, like there's not really a Democratic Steve Bannon, right? But like this notion of we are constantly feeding our voters rage juice, right? Like, and every day when at my job at America Rising was to come up with some other crazy thing some liberal did to make people mad. And you can see this now on absolute steroids from when I did it back in 2013. Like we were just saying, there's a libs of TikTok feed that's just like, here's the craziest lib in your life. I see this though on the left, right? And like, you don't really know where that comes, right? And there is like these resistance Twitter feeds and, left-wing media outlets and some of even my colleagues on MSNBC sometimes. It's just like every day I'm going to give you your daily dose of rage and make you mad about how bad the right is. Most of the times they're true things. Some days, it feels a little bit like hyperbole and like, shouldn't we be talking about something else? Or like, shouldn't we be giving people constructive things that they could be doing? So I that's like one parallel, this sort of game of the political media incestuousness and feeding people's anger where it's like a little bit fun for us almost, or like it's your job to like get clicks and get retweets and the impact on the people who aren't in on the joke. I just don't know how that will turn out, but you can imagine a really aggrieved Democratic electorate emerging. You're already seeing that, right? And so then how does that manifest? Again, probably not in Donald Trump, but maybe in some unhealthy ways.
Yeah, I think about it a lot. Both, like I think when you write about sort of, it's not nihilism, I think, that among the consultant class of just like, this is our business, this is what we do.
Right.
We're all kind of buddy in Washington. Anyway, we will try to savage the boss of the other person, then we'll go have beers, and then we'll go work together on corporate clients, which is which I think that is a thing that's changed a little bit since Trump, just because people can't really be in the same room anymore, and that's probably good in my view. I actually found that, like when I worked in CA, I found that part really fucking gross. Actually, was that sort of camaraderie, like there's like real stuff there. But I do like you do a thing where you go through all the different. You do this in the context of why people supported Trump. Like why your friends and former colleagues supported Trump, and you have like a bunch of archetypes to do it, which is a great section of the book everyone should read. But it's also a set of archetypes about people who are in politics and why they're in politics, right?
Yeah.
And I was trying to identify myself in that group, which is very disturbing and uncomfortable.
Yeah, where'd you find yourself?
Somewhere.
Messianic complex?
yes. All the messianic people end up in communications, the very important part. I thought of myself, like I was someone who, like I was raised a Democrat. I cared about like politics. We talked about it in my house. I got into it at a young age. But what I loved, at least in the beginning days, was like the intensity of the winning and losing, right? The campaigns, right? That was like for an overly competitive person. Yeah. That's right. And then you obviously everyone in your group, like you talk about people who want to be in the mix. Right. Everyone in politics wants to be in the mix. If you don't want to be in the mix, you're not in politics, right? Like, as you point out, there are a lot of people who pretend not to be in the mix, and like that's their shtick, which is I never talk to reporters, right? But I definitely want every reporter to know who I am as someone who doesn't talk to reporters. I was sort of thinking in that context of reading it, like whether that I think that changed a little bit on the Democratic side in ways it didn't on the Republican side, in part because Obama won, right? And Obama was a different sort of character, I think.
Yeah, I actually think I think there's some areas of similarity, like the rage juice I was just talking about. I think that the one area of difference, especially as you get younger than us, is like the cultures on the campaign cultures on both sides have completely diverged. And the Republican kids are nihilists, like really freaky nihilists. Like they just like enjoy trolling, and like that's what, because it's Trump, right? So it's like if I was attracted to like George Bush being a compassionate conservative, like they were attracted to Trump, who's a good troll, and so like that's why they take these jobs. Like if you meet the House communications staffer for a random Republican House member, it's disturbing. Okay. The Democratic younger staffers right now are super earnest, like in a way that I think it almost hurts Democratic candidates sometimes, right? Yeah. So like it's almost like the whole the opposite side of this pendulum, right? Where you need to have this balance. I write about this in the book. It's like politics is still a competition, right? So there's nothing wrong with being a little competitive. You just have to have self-awareness, know where your red lines are, not be willing to work for a complete sociopathic monster, right? The Democrats almost fall, sometimes I worry that younger staffers like way over here where they're so earnest that they're like having their politicians say stuff that's like not actually helpful, but that is true. And so it's a nice impulse. But I actually think the cultures have completely diverged in ways that make the Republicans scarier, but also probably a little bit more effective in politics. Right, well,
it's like, I don't know what the median age of a House staffer is, but you're like in your early 20s, right? So if you're 24 years old, Donald Trump was the leader of the Republican Party when he went to college.
Right? Yeah, basically.
And if you are anywhere between, Obama was basically the leader of the Democratic Party or the person in your knowledge if you are anywhere from 24 to 40 something right now.
Yeah, or you were brought in by Bernie.
Yeah. Or Elizabeth Warren or something like that, what do you think is going to happen in the midterms?
It's going to be a bloodbath. I'm hopeful that the Senate is going to be potentially savable for the Democrats because the Republican candidates are so freaky. I mean, you look at the France model, right? Like Macron had Biden-y approval ratings, pretty bad approval ratings, but he ends up winning kind of handily because Le Pen is like a bigoted freak, right? And so could you see that happening like in Georgia with Herschel Walker, as we just brought up, maybe Arizona with Mark Kelly, who's very normal and mainstream, versus like a Blake Masters, like a Peter Thiel, like racist kind of, person that has no real skills. Like what are some of the other races?
Dr. Oz.
Dr. Oz, thank you, in Pennsylvania. Warren Johnson's gotten pretty weird. Can you steal some of these that you wouldn't have usually won if you're the Democrats? I worry a little bit about then some surprises you lose. The Republicans nominated a pretty normal person in Colorado, for example. It's maybe their most normal Senate candidate. It's my home state. That could be a surprise. So the House is gone though, and I worry again if gas prices are this high and just historically the first midterms, you get surprises where like a Republican will win, in Rhode Island or something. Yeah. You know what I mean? So I think that it's going to be pretty ugly. And the thing that worries me the most, not to be too dour, is like Secretary of State's races, right? Like where people don't vote, people don't know who their candidate is. It's just party line. And so if the Democratic base is really depressed and Republican base is not, and we're going to have a lot of like stop the steal conspiracy theorists in Secretary of State's offices, which is pretty concerning.
Yeah, it's the Senate map is sort of candidate dependent, like it was in 2010 when Democrats lost 63 House seats but held on to the Senate because Republicans, which I'll just have been another canary in the coal mine, kept nominating complete lunatics for winnable seats. Are there any Democratic candidates out there, Democratic politicians you think, who are doing things well these days?
I mean, I'm a Jared Polis stan. I don't think that he has a national approach, but he's the governor of Colorado. He's super popular. He's avoided the annoying liberal stuff a little bit at perfect times. Like he did not do mask mandates after the vaccines came out. My dad is my bellwether for this. He's featured in the book as yelling at me for being too mean to Mike Pence. He understood me not liking Trump, but he's like, poor Mike Pence, you don't like him either? And I was like, come on, Dad. But even my dad's kind of fine about Jared Polis. I don't think he's going to vote for him, but he's not angry. So I think he's doing a good job. I think Pete did a good job. I guess I'm picking all the gays. Pete did a good job on Fox this weekend. He's good. The bench though is is concerning. I think Mark Kelly is in Arizona is doing a good job.
What do you think about John Fetterman?
I like Fetterman. I think so. I think the Democrats have three models we don't really know. Like in this post-Trump era, what is your model, right? It's working class. We're gonna undermine the Republican advantage among working class whites. This is your Fetterman model. If people don't know him, he's like the 6'6" dude who just wears a sweatshirt from Pennsylvania, and I'm intrigued by that. He's a little too liberal for my taste, but I think that he could. If he wins this year, who the hell knows? I mean, he might be a Trump presidential person, I think, and a unique thing. Then you have like the Pete and Mark Kelly and Polis model, which is I'm going to appeal to suburban, folks and the Biden coalition, maybe not excite the base as much. And then you have like a Stacey Abrams model, right, which is I'm going to really try to max out the base. Turnout, I think that in a different year that would probably work well. I'm concerned for her that's not going to work well this year. And it's hard to say. Maybe in some cases in certain states the different models are different, but I think that's a problem for the Democrats right now. We don't really know. I'd love to kind of test 2020 5 different ways to know better, or 2022 5 different ways to know better for 2024. But yeah, I mean, like the Fetterman or Kelly or Abrams seem to be the options.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
What do you want people to take away from your book? Well, let me put it this way. I think I'm going to assume you wrote this book for a lot of people out there who found themselves in your position, who early in your career starting to grow uncomfortable with the party, and you're trying to send a message to them. What is that message?
Yeah. That you should quit your job if you feel gross about it. I guess is the short message.
Yeah.
The book at its core is about, and I hope that it's fun and interesting about politics for political junkies, and that, obviously it's a book about politics, but I tried really hard to have some universal themes for people even who are not in politics, that they can take away from this book, that oftentimes in our lives, like we face these choices and these challenges either in our careers or sometimes outside of our careers, and the easy thing to do is like tell yourself a comforting story, which is like, I don't have to do the hard thing here, right? Like I can go along to get along because of X, Y, and Z. And that it's important actually to reflect on that and to think about whether, what you're doing is within your integrity. And I think that looking back, like my regrets is to your question earlier, I saw this in 2008. I saw it. I knew, and I probably should have bailed then. And, I'm hopeful, and I've heard from some 20-somethings that are reading this, that they get that message.
Well, I hope someone in the party leadership gets that message, but
I don't think that Kevin McCarthy's changing his behavior after reading Why We Did It.
I don't think Kevin McCarthy's reading.
Good point. Fair point.
Yes. All right. Our thanks to Tim Miller, author of the amazing new book, Why We Did It. It is a great book about politics, a great book about this moment in American history. I highly encourage everyone to buy it and read it. I'd like to thank our audience for watching and participating here live. Tim will be signing books outside in a few moments. If you'd like to watch more programs or support Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual programming possible, please visit commonwealthclub.org/online. Thank you and stay safe, everyone. Thanks so much.